Hey everybody, Matt Colville here. I hope you did your homework. There was a recent video from Z Bashu, who does the animated spellbook stuff, very popular videos. And in point of fact, at the end, I did not realize this when I was watching it, but at the end of this video, he references an earlier video of mine. And the whole thing, the subject I was talking about, the subject he's talking about, is branching out from Dungeons and Dragons and trying other games, which I am in favor of. When I was in high school and college, my friends and I played dozens of different RPGs, and I would say trying new RPGs was something I did pretty regularly all the way up until my early to mid 30s, at which point, I got to the point where I was like, I can do most of what I want to do narratively inside D&D. I'm never going to run out of stories to tell. And it also kind of became my brief to introduce. I was now working in video games, and I was spending a lot of my time introducing D&D and really role-playing to people who had never played before. And I did that at Pandemic Studios, and then I did it at Turtle Rock. And obviously now I make videos about how to be a better dungeon master and how easy and fun it is to get behind the screen and run the game yourself. So most people think of me as the D&D guy, and that is entirely reasonable. I would go so far as to say I often think of myself as a D&D guy. But there are other games out there, and as I said in the intro to the first Games You Might Like video, there are definitely folks out there right now who are playing D&D because it's the game they know, it's the popular game, and they are butting their heads up against some problem, and they go online and they say, what's the problem? And the response they get, this is not universal, sometimes there really is a problem with the game, but the response some folks get is, you probably should be trying a different game. D&D is mostly about fighting monsters, and you're kind of trying to shoehorn this other thing into it. And then Z put out a video talking about his experiences trying to branch out from D&D, specifically going to Blades in the Dark. And he had a lot of really interesting things to say, and that started the wheels spinning with me, and I thought I'd make a video. I'm going to give you my interpretation of Z's experience branching out from D&D and trying Blades in the Dark, or trying to try Blades in the Dark. And it may be that I'm interpreting what he said wrongly, in which case I hope he arrives and speaks up for himself. And also, I haven't played Blades in the Dark, so this is not an endorsement nor a condemnation of that, although I would like to see Blades in the Dark featured in the Other Games You Might Like series. Z wanted to run a heist, which is also, by the way, something I'm planning on doing. And folks online were saying, oh, if you want to run a heist, you should try Blades in the Dark. And he went, okay, there's a lot of really positive reactions out there to Blades in the Dark, and people typically focus on how good it is for running heists. But once he bought the book and opened it up and started reading it, he discovered that the overwhelming majority of the information in the book was about the world, the city that Blades in the Dark campaigns take place in. And this is a problem, because what Z wanted was a system for running a heist that would be fun and somewhat lightweight and fulfill that fantasy of, watching, what was that TV show all about heists? Leverage, I think. That simulating that team of group of people getting together and trying to infiltrate, casing a joint and then infiltrating it and trying to get out without the security guards discovering it. And if you're going to the game because you just want this lightweight system that simulates the style and feel, having to wade through all of the fantasy of this very specific world is a bit of a pain in the butt. And that was Z's experience. I just want these lightweight rules, but all I can see is all this information about the calendar of the world and what all the districts are named and stuff like that. And they were a little bit too intertwined, and it wasn't easy for him to extract out of Blades in the Dark what he wanted, which was just a simple system for running a heist. Now, I may have interpreted what he said wrongly, in which case I apologize, but it did make me think of an important point when we start talking about other games outside of Dungeons and Dragons, especially when we're talking to people who have only played D&D. And that is the folks trying to tell you, hey, you should try this other game, often do not do a good job of explaining why they're recommending it. Are they recommending it because they love the setting and the world, or are they recommending it because they love the system? And the rules of a game have a huge impact on the types of games you can run in it. This is not immediately obvious if you've only ever played one RPG. Doesn't matter if that one RPG is D&D or not. If you've only ever played one RPG, it's not easy for you to imagine how do the rules affect the gameplay. Surely we can do anything we want with this D20 system. Well, sort of. So I think it would be really good when we as a community talk about other games, if we include in our discussion how intertwined the rules and the setting are. How easy is it to extract the one from the other? I'll tell you, coming up in the 1980s, there were lots of fantasy RPGs that had really cool, unique mechanics. I'm thinking of Harn Master, Harn World, whatever product you want to reference here. And folks would buy these products not for the rules, which were often, really cool. There's an 18% chance your character will get cholera before you're through character creation in Harn Master. But we loved the source books. We loved the setting. There were lots of games in the 80s. They were completely independent of Dungeons & Dragons. They had their own rules, sometimes their own dice systems, and we bought them and we used them, and we never used the rules. We only ever used the setting. So sometimes when people are telling you why they love a game, it's not clear. Are they in love with the rule system? Are they in love with the setting? And how closely intertwined are these two things? That's it, basically. That's the point of the video. From here on out, we're just going to talk about an example. I just think that when we talk about other games, it is useful for all of us who have a favorite game or a game we're really interested in or like Numenera or Fall of Delta Green or Blades in the Dark or Morkborg. What is it about that we like? And remember that you're talking mostly to D&D players because that's mostly who's out there. And if there's someone casting about for a new game to try, it's probably someone who has already played D&D and is looking for something else. So it helps us, all of us in the community, facilitate those people finding the right game if we include in our description, what are the rules? What's the setting? How do these two things interface? Is one more important than the other? And what do I like about it? And the example that I'm going to give is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition. This game, this giant box tome of a game that I bought many years ago and is now out of print. It's now been replaced with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition, which I haven't checked out. And I'm not really recommending that product, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition. My friends and I tried to play it and we found it pretty drastically overproduced, but I did sort of fall in love with the die mechanic, and that is what I want to describe to you right now. This dice system, which I think is very cool, is still in use. I believe it is the Star Wars, Fantasy Flight's Star Wars RPG, Edge of the Empire, uses the same dice pool. I think the facings have different symbols on them. And I think there might be a generic Fantasy Flight RPG system that uses the same basic idea. And it's not like Dungeons & Dragons where you roll a 20-sided die and you do a little bit of math and you say, in fact, you don't even need to do math in D&D a lot of the time. Remember, you can roll a 20-sided die on your turn when you're trying to attack this goblin. And if you rolled a 1 to 6, you missed, and if you rolled a 15 or higher, you're going to hit. You don't really need to do the math for that. You only need to do the math in the middle. So we're going to talk about how this system works, and we're going to contrast it to D&D, and we're going to talk about how these two different game mechanics produce very different styles of game. In both games, D&D, Warhammer Fantasy 3rd Edition, you can fight monsters, you can have chases, you can do all sorts of stuff. But the encounter that I use as an example for why I love this dice system came from the first session I ran from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition, where my friends were playing. I was the dungeon master, and midway through the adventure, they needed to stop this horse-drawn carriage, a coach basically, from getting away because the bad guy was in it. So they all got on horses and they start riding after him. And one of the players says, I'm going to try and jump from my horse onto the carriage, and that's when the dice system sort of came to the fore and started to shine. So here's how a player would have built their dice pool in order to resolve that task. What happens when I try to leap from this horse that I'm on and jump onto the escaping carriage? The first thing the player does is they add the blue dice to the pool, which represents how good are they at jumping off a moving horse onto a moving carriage. And the better they are at that kind of thing, if they have good strength or good athletics, they add more of these dice. And automatically you see that there's something interesting going on because some of the facings are blank and some of them have this interesting symbol on them, which is a hammer. It's probably a warhammer. This is probably the symbol that the game is named after. And then you get this interesting little eagle symbol that's also on here. So some results can be nothing. Some can be a success. That's what this hammer means. It means you have accumulated a success. And in fact, it looks like the blue die only has single successes and then boons. This is called a boon. And right away, we start to see the magic of this system is that I can not only succeed if I get enough hammers, depending on how challenging the task is, I can also succeed and something cool happens, because that's what this symbol means. This symbol is the boon symbol, and it means whatever else happens, success or failure, something cool happens. Then I, the Dungeon Master, add purple dice depending on how difficult the task is. And right out of the gate, you can see that we have even more different facings. And in fact, none of the same facings from the blue die to the purple die. We've got crossed swords. We've got 2 crossed swords, and we've got a skull. That's never good. I've never known a skull to be good on a result. And we've got, what is this? We've got a chaos symbol. So the crossed swords mean failure. And when you're done rolling your dice, you count up all the hammers and subtract all the crossed swords. And if you have more hammers than crossed swords, you have more successes than failures, and the task succeeds. But you'll notice that sometimes you can have 2 failures, which means you need a lot more successes. In fact, there are other dice we're going to get to in a second, but you can also get a bane, and that means something bad happens. Banes are the opposites of boons, right? So you can succeed and something bad happens, or you could fail and something good happens. Now, there are more dice we're going to add to this pool, but right out of the gate, you can see why I like this. I loved the idea that the players would roll, right? We would build this dice pool based on how good are you at this? How risky is it? What are your chances of failure? A whole bunch of stuff goes into this dice pool that we'll get to in a second. And then they roll the dice, they consult the bones. They count successes or failures. If they get more successes than failures, they succeed. But if a bane comes up, even though they succeeded, something bad happens. And in fact, in the example I'm using, my friend jumped from the horse onto the cart, built his dice pool, rolled the dice, succeeded, but got a bane. And I love that because it meant I had to sit there and think, well, how can you succeed at this, but also face a setback? And what I said was, you leap onto the moving carriage, you grab a hold of it, but it's raining, you slip, and now you're hanging from your fingernails. You're still on the carriage, but the carriage is hurtling down the road. If you slip and fall, you'll be ground under the wheels. What do you do now? And me, as a dungeon master, as a storyteller, especially coming from Dungeons and Dragons, which doesn't really work that way, I love that Indiana Jones style, out of the frying pan into the fire, yes, but, or no, and kind of gameplay. It made the game feel, it moved better, the game moved better, the action was always moving forward, there was always tension. Now, there are some downsides to this, there are some advantages to the D&D system, but let's get back to the dice pool. So how good are you at trying to jump onto a moving carriage? How challenging is jumping onto a moving carriage? And we didn't talk about what the chaos symbol means. The chaos symbol is, or the chaos star means not just you face a setback, but something really bad happens. It's like a super version of the skull. The next thing you add to the pool is dice based on what's called your stance in Warhammer Fantasy, which is how reckless are you being? If you're being very conservative, you're going to add a couple of green dice to your pool. If you're being very reckless, you're going to add some red dice, and these have different facings. Look, here on the green die, there's a facing that has both a success and a boon. And here we get a new symbol that we haven't seen before. Here, there's a facing that's a success and the hourglass symbol. The hourglass symbol means something is delayed. Either your success is delayed somehow or your failure is delayed. And it usually means your initiative shifts somehow. You're going to start acting later in the round, but there are a couple of different effects for this. You'll see most of the facings are single success because the green die is yours. It comes from you. The purple dice comes from the Dungeon Master and has bad results. These dice come from the player and only have good results. But this is a very reckless, what you're being very reckless. If you're being very reckless, then you can get all sorts of interesting results, like here's 2 hammers, here's 2 boons. There's a skull on here, so bad things can happen if you're very reckless. And not only is there a skull, you can fail, you can also succeed, but that little teardrop symbol means you exert yourself. So you get a success, but you accumulate some fatigue, probably. Then the question is, yeah, maybe you're really strong because this is an athletics check, but are you trained in athletics? In that case, you're going to add an expertise dice. And expertise dice only have good results. You're either going to get a boon, you're going to get a success, maybe nothing happens, which when there are critical failures on other dice, nothing happening can be good. But also on here somewhere is the comet symbol. And the comet symbol is the good version of the chaos star. The chaos star means this is a critical failure. It's worse than a failure. It's a critical failure. This is better than a success. It's a critical success. Something spectacularly good is going to happen. Something spectacularly bad is going to happen. And let's imagine your character is cursed. Let's imagine a old hag put a curse on you. The DM might say, well, you're dealing with some negative effects right now, and add some black dice to your pool. Black dice have failures. They have banes. There's a bunch of nothing happens, which is, not that bad. Likewise, maybe a friend of yours is helping you out. Maybe you're getting aid. Your friend helps you out. You get a white die. White dice only have good things. Successes, a boon. And if your friend who's helping you out is really good at the thing they're helping you out at, maybe you'll add two white dice to your pool. It's very rare in this game, I think, that you would roll a dice pool that has all of these dice in it, or this number of dice in it. Is somebody helping you out? Have you been cursed? Probably not. But the thing I like about this is all these different facings give me, the Dungeon Master, lots of different opportunities to interpret the result and come up with some creative and interesting way to move the action forward. And there are facings that we haven't covered. There's like something good happens, but you get the hourglass. The hourglass means you are delayed. You move further down in the initiative. There's something good happens with a plus on the expertise dice. Something good happens with a plus means you get to add another die to your pool and roll it again. And the game is designed for these dice. So there's all sorts of interesting, very specific game mechanical effects, magical effects, the Warhammer Fantasy version of like exhaustion and stuff like that these dice can produce. So it should be clear at this point why I think these dice are cool, because I love not knowing what's going to happen and watching and reading the bones and then trying to be creative and invent an interpretation of what the dice says that moves the action forward. And if that sounds like it would be tedious for you, well, that's probably not your kind of game. But for me, I loved it. It was very inspiring. I never had a problem interpreting the dice. Every time the dice came up, I was like, ooh, well, that means probably this happens. So for me, my style of dungeon mastering, it was a lot of fun and hugely refreshing. That being said, there is a downside to this, and it has to do with styles of play. First of all, building a dice pool, right? How many dice I add, looking at my character sheet, I'm getting some dice from this, I'm getting some dice from this, and somebody goes, don't worry, I'm helping you out. Here's my white die. Oh, don't forget, you got a blessing. Here's a yellow die, and then the dungeon master puts dice in, and you roll the dice, and you start adding all this stuff up. It can take a while. It might take 5 minutes for you to finish adding everything up and subtracting and telling the dungeon master, okay, here's what I got. And that is not conducive to the Dungeons & Dragons tactical assumptions. Dungeons & Dragons, the D20 system, 5th edition, is great for this is a game about fighting monsters, and fighting monsters is important, right? Whether you hit or miss is important, and you're going to attempt to hit or miss 7 or 8 times. And every player at the table is trying to do the same thing, which means we're going to go around over and over again. And these tiny little adjustments, whether you did 2 damage or 8 damage when you're fighting goblins, makes a big difference. And there's 7 or 8 goblins, and each goblin matters. And where we are in position on the board matters. Where we are in the grid is super important. Do we have flanking? Do we have line of sight? This stuff, because the game's about fighting monsters, all that minutia can become very important. And in a game like that, where we're hyper-focusing on exactly how many monsters there are, where the characters are positioned, exactly how many hit points they have, rolling a d20 and going, I missed, next, is very useful. It keeps the game moving. I know it seems tedious sometimes when you're stuck into 5th edition. It seems like sometimes players can take a long time on their turn. They can take a long time on their turn, but it doesn't have to. Often you roll, you get a 20, I know I hit, and now I start rolling my dice and I tell the dungeon master I did 27 damage to that goblin and my turn is over. I roll, I missed. Next. We only notice it when a turn takes a long time. There is no version of I rolled a 3, I missed, move on when you're building a giant dice pool and you're rolling it. It always takes a long time to build a big dice pool and count it all up. But that's fine if fighting this Minotaur is something that's going to, the entire battle between you and this Minotaur is going to be resolved with 1 dice pool roll, right? If you're thinking at a different scale, if fighting monsters isn't so important that we're tracking individual hit points for 7 or 8 different types of goblins in this one encounter, then we can do stuff like just roll a dice pool, read the results, resolve that challenge, and move on. This is a very high-level overview and comparison between 2 different games. The differences between Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition and Dungeons & Dragons is enormous. They're two completely different games. But if we zoom way in on just the die mechanic, what do you do on your turn? When it's time for you to resolve a task, how do you do it? In D&D, you roll a d20, you add a number, you tell the DM, they compare it to a target number, and you either succeed or you fail, and you move on. And that means we can get a lot of actions in one combat. One combat in Dungeons & Dragons might take 90 minutes. That means fighting in Dungeons & Dragons is important, but that's not how it works in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. You might spend 90 minutes on a challenge, but a ton of amazing stuff could happen in that challenge, and it's a lot more like Indiana Jones trying to fight his way across an entire caravan of Nazi tanks and trucks, trying to get to the one that has the Ark in it. And the camera can zoom out and can show us the entire caravan, and Indiana Jones going from one truck to the next, or it can zoom way in and show us the fight in the driver's seat between Indiana Jones and the Nazi driver. Those two different dice mechanics work the way they do on purpose because each of their goals is to further a certain style of play. Dungeons & Dragons is much more tactical, it's much more wargamey, it's much more about focusing on individual monsters, and we're tracking individual hit points, rounds, players going one round after the other. How many rounds is this battle going to last is very important, and I think those of us that have played D&D for a long time, we all take it for granted. But a system like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay gives us a very different way to play and a different kind of adventure to run and a different way to tell a story. And I love D&D. I'll be playing D&D for the rest of my life, but gosh, I think these dice are cool. I like rolling them. And if I were telling a certain kind of story, a more pulp fiction, pulp fantasy Indiana Jones story, I would like to use these dice. Now, I'm not an expert on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd edition. You're going to see people in the comments going, no, that's not how that works. But they'll probably be objecting to my specific interpretations of dice facings. And they will be able to explain exactly how fans of this game, and again, this dice pool system is still in production, I believe, just not for Warhammer. They will be able to explain all of the interesting ways in which these dice can affect your character, the enemy, the encounter. I think it's all fascinating. So let's not get hung up on exactly how these dice work. That's not the point. The point is I wanted to introduce you folks, some of whom, not all, some of you have never played a game besides 5th edition D&D. I wanted to get the gears working on how a dice mechanic, how a resolution mechanic can be so different from rolling a d20, adding a number, telling your DM, and then they say you hit or you missed. By now, you know I love Dungeons & Dragons. I have a lot of affection for 5th edition, but I have affection for every edition of D&D. But I also like other games, and even though Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is no longer in production, this dice mechanic is still out there. It was used in their Star Wars game. It's used in, I think it's called the Genesis system, but it's Genesis with like a Y, and I don't know a lot about that. I'm sure there are people in the doobly-doo or in the comments who will be able to explain that. But the point is just that the resolution mechanic for an RPG has a massive impact on the tone, the style of play, the action. How does action progress? How does the plot progress? What kind of stories are we going to tell in this system? And if I've done a good job, you who have only ever played 5th edition D&D can maybe understand now how the D20, even though you may be used to some players taking a long time, some battles taking a long time, how easy and fast the D20 can be compared to another system like this, which can be quite involved. But with this system, you can tell a whole story just with one die roll. Thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks to Z Bashu for plugging one of my videos in his video. I have now returned the favor, but my goal was just to try to open up the discussion and help everybody talking about other games to be a little bit more specific about what is it about this game do you like? Are you a huge fan of Warhammer and the Warhammer Fantasy universe? I know a lot of people who are. I'm not particularly. I like it. I'm not a huge fan of it. Or is it the dice mechanic you like? Yeah, I really like the dice mechanic. And what is it about the dice mechanic you like? What is it about the rules you like? What is it about the setting you like? Which is more important to you? And why are you recommending this game? That's it, folks. Thanks for watching. Next video, good question. Until then, peace out.